A Mafia boss arrived home unannounced just as the clock struck noon and found a sight that instantly stole his breath and defied all reality. The heavy brass keys, flung carelessly, clattered against the imported marble floor of the cavernous foyer, the sound echoing like a single gunshot through the deathly silence of the mansion. Yet no one seemed to register the intrusion. Dominic Blackwood, a man whose very presence was enough to make the entire New York criminal underworld tremble, stood frozen solid in the doorway of his own dining room. The blood in his veins simultaneously turned to glacial ice while searing hot fury boiled behind his temples. What unfolded before his eyes made no logical sense. It had to be a hallucination, perhaps a cruel manifestation of stress, or maybe a twisted joke orchestrated by fate itself. He had come home 3 hours ahead of schedule on an ordinary Tuesday, merely intending to retrieve some overlooked legal documents before retreating to his glass-walled fortress of an office in the heart of Manhattan. He had anticipated finding absolute emptiness in this palatial tomb, certainly no human warmth, and absolutely nothing resembling the scene that was playing out. It was happening right in front of him, centered on the massive imported mahogany table, a relic no one had dared use since his wife's funeral 4 years prior. A quiet rebellion was taking place, a violation of every sacred rule established in this house. Sophia, the young housekeeper, barely 27 years old, dressed in her immaculately starched blue and white uniform, was not polishing antique silverware or dusting the crystal cabinets. She was sitting down, and she was not alone. Around her, occupying chairs reserved only for highly respected politicians and powerful business partners, were 4 children, 4 little boys perfectly identical. Dominic blinked slowly, trying to recalibrate his vision. The children could not have been older than 4 years of age. They wore cheap, patched blue shirts that struck Dominic with a sudden, jarring sense of familiarity, as if the fabric itself had been ripped from a forgotten corner of his own youth, coupled with makeshift light-colored aprons crudely tied across their chests. They were 4 drops of water. 4 flawless replicas with tangled brown hair and large, expressive eyes that keenly followed the young woman's every motion. "Open wide, my little birds," Sophia whispered in a voice so overwhelmingly sweet and tender that it caused a sharp, unexpected ache in Dominic's hardened chest. As she spoke, she held a large spoon heaped high with simple, steaming golden rice. A food so plain it was a violent contrast to the luxurious porcelain dinnerware surrounding them. This was not the cuisine of the wealthy elite. This was sustenance for survival. Rice dyed yellow, likely with cheap turmeric or coloring. Yet, the children gazed at it as if it were pure, edible gold. When the child sitting on the far left turned his head, letting out a small, delighted giggle at something his brother had done, the cascading light from the huge crystal chandelier illuminated his precise profile. Dominic felt the floor drop out from beneath him, that sharp nose, that specific arrogant curve of the lips when smiling. Even the distinct, innate elegance with which the child held his fork, which seemed utterly mismatched to his patched and humble clothing. It was like staring into a funhouse mirror that hadn't just reflected his image, but had distorted time itself, sending him crashing back 3 decades into his own childhood. Dominic's heart began to hammer with painful, frantic violence, beating against his ribs like a caged beast desperately trying to escape a prison of bone. Who were they? Where in God's name had they come from? His mansion was a fortress, secured by high granite walls and sophisticated security systems. No one, not a soul, entered without his direct, explicit permission, and yet 4 tiny intruders were seated there, consuming golden rice at his forbidden table, being tended to by his housekeeper as if they were the secret, hidden royalty of a forgotten kingdom. He took 1 step forward. The Italian leather of his bespoke shoes creaked ever so slightly against the hardwood floor. The sound was nearly imperceptible to anyone else, but to Sophia, a young woman who lived in a constant, painful state of high alert, the tiny sound was like a sudden, deafening clap of thunder. The young woman went completely rigid. The spoon, suspended midway to a child's expectant mouth, froze in midair. Slowly, terror painting her face a sickly, deathly pale. She turned her head toward the imposing silhouette in the doorway. Their eyes met, The freezing gray of Dominic's accusatory gaze collided head-on with the frightened, desperate brown of Sophia's. Time ceased its flow. The four children, sensing their protector's sudden, overwhelming fear, simultaneously stopped eating and turned their small heads toward the massive, menacing figure blocking their only exit. Dominic could not draw a breath. Now, looking at them front-on, the horrifying truth hit him with the indisputable force of a freight train slamming into a wall. They were not merely children who bore a resemblance to him. They were identical, for perfect, genetically flawless copies of himself, staring back at him with a confusing mixture of innocent curiosity and deeply ingrained, instinctive fear. If the story satisfies your soul, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs a good story today. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss what happens next. The absolute silence shattered abruptly, like a fragile pane of glass struck forcefully with a heavy hammer. What the hell is this? Dominic's voice roared, a seismic force that echoed through the vast dining room, making the crystal chandeliers tremble violently above their heads. It wasn't a question seeking an answer. It was the thunderous declaration of an angry, territorial god. The primal growl of a beast whose sovereign territory had been invaded and violated. Sophia sprang up from her chair as if jolted by a high-voltage electrical charge, moving so fast that the spoon in her hand flew across the room and clanged against the tiled floor with a sharp, metallic ring. But she didn't pause to retrieve it. Instead, she flung her arms wide, forming a thin, fragile wall of bone and flesh between the towering man advancing relentlessly toward her and the four small children huddled fearfully behind her. The cheap, bright yellow rubber gloves she hadn't had time to remove yet gleamed harshly under the dining room lights, suddenly looking like the protective claws of a lioness fiercely guarding her cubs. Oliver, the youngest and most sensitive of the four brothers, instantly broke into a screaming cry. His deep, shuddering sobs tore through the thick air, heavy with fear and panic. His tiny legs ran straight to Sophia's side, and his two arms wrapped desperately around her leg as if it were the only secure lifeline left in the middle of a raging sea. "Mom, Mom," he hiccuped hysterically, burying his face deeply into the stiff fabric of her uniform. The other three, Ethan, Noah, and Lucas, did not cry. They remained huddled tightly behind Sophia, their wide eyes stretched taut with terror, yet not one of them attempted to flee. Something instinctive commanded them to stay pressed against their protector, even though that protector was clearly trembling just as violently as they were. Dominic continued his advance, each step landing like the slow, inexorable beat of a war drum. When he reached the edge of the mahogany table, he lifted his massive hand and slammed it down onto the polished wood surface with a horrific, rending crash. The expensive china jumped high into the air. Crystal glasses rattled furiously against one another, and one plate spun precariously to the edge, then plummeted and exploded on the tile floor into 100 sparkling fragments. The children shrank back, cowering. Oliver cried even louder, but Sophia remained perfectly rooted where she was, refusing to retreat a single inch. "I trusted you," Dominic snarled, the words forced out through teeth clenched like granite. His eyes were literally on fire as he stared directly into the young woman's pale face. "I gave you a job when no one else in this world would even deign to look at you. I gave you a roof, a safe place to live, a chance at a life, and this is how you repay me? By turning my home into some kind of secret daycare, letting a bunch of kids who crawled out of nowhere sit and eat at my table?" He leaned in low, his face only a few handspans from Sophia's. "You know exactly who I am. You know what happens to people who dare to deceive me." Anyone else, any member of his vast empire, would have collapsed instantly to their knees right then. They would have begged, sobbed uncontrollably, pleaded desperately for their lives. Dominic had personally witnessed cold-blooded contract killers shake like autumn leaves in his presence. He had watched notorious international drug traffickers cry like terrified children when he subjected them to interrogation. But this girl, this 27-year-old housemaid with labor-hardened hands and brown eyes drenched in unshed tears, did not kneel. Sophia drew a deep, shuddering breath, fighting with every ounce of strength she possessed to steady the shake in her voice. Then, She lifted her chin, locking her gaze straight into the ice-gray inferno of the Mafia boss's eyes. "You can kill me right now," she said, her voice thin and trembling, yet utterly devoid of weakness. "You can do anything you want to me. I truly don't care. But please, please don't touch them. They're only children. They are innocent." Dominic froze, as if he had taken a devastating physical punch to the chest. In 15 years of brutally ruling New York's underworld, no one had ever dared to look him in the eye like that. No one had dared to speak to him in that specific tone. A half-plea, half-challenge wrapped in unwavering conviction. She was not afraid of dying. She was only afraid for the children. That singular fact confused him more profoundly than anything he had encountered in years. "Explain," he ordered, his voice still cold as Antarctic ice, but lowered slightly, indicating a momentary cessation of immediate violence. "Everything, from the very beginning to the bitter end. And if you dare to lie to me even by a single word." He didn't need to complete the threat. Sophia understood the gravity entirely. But even as he spoke, Dominic's gaze remained irresistibly drawn to the oldest child standing directly behind Sophia, Ethan. The boy was staring back at him with eyes the exact same, unmistakable shade of gray, as though Dominic were suddenly staring into a terrifying, miniaturized mirror. Sophia swallowed convulsively, her throat dry as a desert wind. She knew this was her only chance, perhaps her absolute last chance, to articulate the truth. To save 4 small lives that were trembling desperately behind the insufficient shield of her body. She drew in a deep, fortifying breath and began to speak, her voice still shaking with residual fear, but every word distinct, every word ringing with painful truth. "I am an orphan," she said quietly, her eyes dropping briefly to the floor, unable to sustain the confrontation. "I don't know who my parents are. I was found discarded in a trash bin when I was only a few days old, and I grew up in St. Mary's Orphanage in Brooklyn. The day I turned 18, they put me out because I was too old to stay. No diploma, absolutely no skills, not a single penny to my name." She paused for a single, aching heartbeat, and painful memories flickered rapidly in her brown eyes. "I begged for work everywhere, but no one would hire me. Who wants to hire an orphan girl with no sponsor, no fixed address?" By the time I was 23, I was living entirely on the streets, sleeping in dark alleys, eating leftovers scraped out of the trash bins behind restaurants. I nearly starved to death. I almost froze solid that cruel winter. Dominic didn't speak, remaining absolutely still, but he was listening with an intensity that demanded attention. The gray in his eyes no longer burned with pure, white-hot rage. In its place was a cold, ruthless watchfulness, measuring every sentence, every minute flicker of her facial expression. "Father Antonio saved me," Sophia continued, her voice gaining a fragile resilience. "He found me passed out behind St. Michael's Church on a night of sleet and freezing rain. He gave me a tiny place to stay. He gave me food. He gave me hope. I lived in a small room behind the rectory doing odd jobs to repay him." Her voice caught sharply in her throat. "Then, one night, for years ago, there was a massive storm. Rain pouring down, thunder and lightning crashing right outside. I heard crying, so small, so faint, coming from behind the church. At first, I convinced myself I was imagining it, but it kept going. It wouldn't stop. I ran out into the pouring rain, and I found them." Sophia turned her head toward the 4 children huddled tightly behind her, and her entire gaze softened, filling with a profound, unconditional love. For newborn babies, abandoned in a cardboard box that was soaked completely through. They were wrapped in old, torn cloth, their skin turning purple from the cold, their lips gray. They cried so weakly I almost didn't hear them at all. The doctor later told me, if you'd found them even 1 hour later, they would have been dead. She looked back at Dominic, her eyes bright with moisture, but she fought fiercely to hold back every single drop. "I couldn't leave them. I know exactly what it feels like to be thrown away like trash. I know what it feels like when nobody in the world wants you. I couldn't let them die the way I nearly died." She recounted the struggle of the last 4 years. 4 years spent desperately trying to raise 4 children on the meager wages of unskilled labor. She took every kind of job available. Mopping floors, washing endless dishes, doing mountains of laundry. Anything anyone would pay for. The yellow rice, that cheap grain colored with turmeric, was literally the only thing she could afford to cook every single day. "I started working for you 2 years ago," Sophia said, her voice growing smaller, guilt edging her tone. "This job pays more than anywhere I've ever worked. I rented a tiny, run-down apartment in the Bronx to hide the children. And every day, I rushed back immediately after work to feed and care for them. I know I shouldn't have done it. I know I was actively deceiving you, but I didn't have any other choice that meant survival." She stopped, swallowing down the tightness that threatened to choke her. 2 weeks ago, the apartment burned down. An electrical short in the middle of the night. We lost everything. Clothes, furniture, papers. Everything we owned vanished. I had nowhere left to go. No money to even put a deposit on a new place. I risked my life bringing them here, hiding them in rooms you never step into, feeding them quickly when you weren't home. I knew if I was discovered, I would surely die, but at least they would have a solid roof over their heads. At least they wouldn't have to sleep on the street. Sophia stared straight into Dominic's imposing eyes, and the fear in her voice hardened into determined steel. "I don't know whose children they are. I don't know who abandoned them or who wanted them dead. But I know one thing for certain. Someone deliberately threw 4 newborn babies out in a blizzard to die, and I would rather be killed myself than let that happen to them." The vast room sank into an absolute silence that felt heavier than stone. Dominic didn't utter a word, but his mind was already spinning with cold, precise calculations. 4 children, 4 years old, quadruplets, and they looked exactly like him, like 4 perfect copies forged in his image. The critical timing of their birth 4 years ago was precisely when Elizabeth, his late wife, was still alive. Something was drastically wrong here. Something was very, very wrong indeed. Dominic stood motionless for a long, agonizing period. His gray eyes fixed on the 4 small children as if he could forcibly extract the answers he needed from their small, innocent faces. Then he made a decision, quick and brutal. "Marcus!" He grated into his phone, his voice hard as tempered steel. "Get here now. Prepare the large guest suite, a room for 5 people, the maid and the 4 children. No one goes in or out without my explicit order." He turned back to Sophia, his gaze holding not a trace of warmth or mercy. "You will stay here until I find the truth. If you lie to me by even one word, you will wish you had never been born." Sophia did not speak. She only nodded once, a gesture of weary acceptance, and quickly led the 4 children after the tall, silent bodyguard who had materialized abruptly in the doorway. Oliver was still sobbing softly, clinging desperately to her hand, and Ethan, the oldest, turned back to look at Dominic one last time before disappearing behind the closing door. The child's eyes haunted him. Those gray eyes, identical to the ones he saw in the mirror every single morning. The moment the door shut, Dominic pulled out his phone again. "Marcus, I need you to find out everything about these 4 children. Their origin, their birth certificates, the hospital where they were born, all of it. Report to me in 24 hours. But the instant he ended the call, Dominic knew he couldn't wait 24 hours. He couldn't wait even 1 hour. Questions were burning him raw from the inside, doubts gnawing at his mind like a pack of starving wolves tearing at flesh. He needed concrete answers right now, and he knew precisely where he could get them. The clock had just struck 11 at night when Dominic's black Bentley sedan came to a silent, imposing stop in front of Dr. Richard Hayes's secluded mansion in a quiet, privileged Long Island suburb. The elderly doctor had served the powerful Blackwood family loyally for 30 years. He knew every medical secret they had, from the bullet wounds Dominic took during territory wars to the specific strain of cancer that stole his father's life. If anyone knew anything about those 4 children, it had to be Hayes. Dominic didn't bother knocking. He kicked the heavy oak door inward with a single violent blow. Dr. Hayes was seated placidly in his living room, a snifter of aged whiskey warming in his hand. When the door burst open and the massive, angry shadow of the Mafia boss filled the frame. The glass dropped instantly to the carpet and shattered with a delicate tinkling sound. But no one cared about the waste. "Dominic?" the old doctor stammered out, his face immediately turning the color of a fresh corpse. "What is it? That 5 years ago?" Dominic cut him off instantly. His voice was so cold it seemed capable of freezing the entire room solid. "When I had my appendix removed at your hospital, did anyone take my sperm?" Dr. Hayes went completely still, petrified. His wrinkled skin shifted from a terrifying chalk white to an ugly, mottled gray, his old eyes blinking rapidly, trying desperately to dodge Dominic's cutting, relentless stare. I don't understand what you are saying," he stammered, backing away slowly like a cornered, frightened animal. "It was a normal surgery. There was nothing abnormal." Dominic didn't utter another word. He reached inside his coat, drew a heavy, blued steel handgun, and set it down hard on the mahogany table directly in front of the doctor. Metal met wood, and the sound rang through the silent, luxurious room like a sudden death bell. "I'm asking you for the last time," Dominic said, his voice no louder than a low, deadly whisper, yet more terrifying than any scream. "And you know I never ask a third time." Dr. Hayes collapsed into a nearby armchair, his head instantly dropping into his shaking hands, his entire body convulsing. Silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, for several seconds. Then he began to speak, his voice thin and hollow, like the moan of a dying man. "Yes, we did it. While you were under the anesthesia, we took a sample of your sperm." "I'm sorry, Dominic. I didn't have any other choice." "Who?" Dominic roared, finally allowing his fury to break. "Who ordered you to do it?" The doctor lifted his head, his eyes brimming with raw fear and desperate pleading. "Victoria," he whispered, the name landing in the air like a fatal curse. "Victoria Blackwood. Your mother. She claimed it was to preserve it for family medical purposes in case something happened to you. She said that if I didn't do it, she would destroy my career, destroy my entire life. You know your mother, Dominic. You know no one can refuse her." Dominic stood like a monument carved from cold stone. His mother, his own mother, Victoria Blackwood, the true, calculating power behind the entire Blackwood empire. The woman who had given birth to him, raised him, and meticulously shaped him into the undisputed ruler of New York's underworld. She had orchestrated this. He picked up the gun slowly and slid it back into his coat holster. "If you tell anyone about tonight's conversation," he said without turning around, walking toward the shattered door, "I won't even need a gun." He walked out of the house, leaving the old, broken doctor trembling violently in the sudden dark. The Bentley's engine growled deep and low when he floored the gas pedal, tearing into the quiet night, hurtling toward Manhattan, where his mother was sleeping peacefully in her lavish mansion, completely unaware that her son was carrying a storm of cold fury built from 15 years of meticulous deception. The clock had just struck 2 in the morning when Dominic's Bentley came to an aggressive stop in front of the massive iron gates of the Blackwood Mansion on Manhattan's Upper East Side. This was where his mother held court, a miniature Gilded Age palace in the heart of the city, a tangible symbol of the power and wealth she had spent decades building with her own ruthless hands. Dominic didn't wait for security to fumble with the remote access. He pressed the external remote and drove straight in, the tires grinding over the white gravel driveway at a speed only a madman, or a man possessed, would attempt. He kicked the front door wide open, brushed violently past the half-awake servants who were hurrying out of the shadows, and stormed up the grand staircase leading to the primary bedroom suite. Victoria Blackwood had already been woken by the commotion below. But when her bedroom door flew open with a crashing bang and her son appeared, his eyes on fire with cold, controlled fury, she didn't appear frightened at all. She sat up regally on the king-sized bed, draped in white silk sheets, pulling a wine-red silk robe around her shoulders. Astonishingly, her face was still perfectly made up, even in the middle of the night, as if she had somehow known this specific, inevitable visit was coming. "My son," she said, her voice unervingly calm, as if she were inviting a guest for afternoon tea. What disaster has occurred that you've come home at this ungodly hour? Your mother thought she had taught you proper behavior. Dominic did not waste breath on formalities. He strode to the foot of the bed, looking down at the woman who had brought him into this world with a stare that felt capable of scorching the entire city to ash. What did you do with my sperm? The question cracked through the expansive room like a sudden, violent gunshot. Any ordinary person would have been genuinely shocked, would have stammered a frantic denial, would have looked confused and lost. But Victoria Blackwood was not ordinary. She merely lifted one perfectly sculpted eyebrow, her flawlessly painted lips curving into a slow, utterly cold smile. And that, Dominic realized, was the most frightening thing of all. She didn't flinch, didn't recoil, didn't deny. "Ah," she said softly, a note of satisfaction in her tone. "So, you know." She rose smoothly from the bed, walked to her vanity table, and poured herself a crystal glass of water. Every movement was slow, composed, and deliberate, as if this were nothing more than an everyday casual conversation between a mother and her son. "I did what was best for the family," she stated, turning to face him, the red silk robe lending her a menacing authority. "Always. Everything I do is exclusively for Blackwood blood. It is the only thing that matters." "Answer my question," Dominic growled, dangerously low. Victoria sighed, long and dramatically, as though explaining the obvious and necessary to a particularly slow-witted child. "You need an heir, Dominic. Blackwood blood cannot possibly end with you. This empire requires a successor. Someone who carries our lineage forward to continue what your father and I have painstakingly built." Her eyes darkened, becoming sharp and judgmental. "But what about your wife, Elizabeth? Useless. 5 years of marriage and she couldn't give you a single child. I waited, I hoped. But she was garbage, a failed vessel. So I had to handle it myself." Dominic felt the blood in his veins turn into a furnace of cold fury. Handle it. How Victoria stepped closer, her proximity oppressive, her eyes glacial and utterly without warmth. "I hired a surrogate, a young woman named Rachel. Poor, desperate, willing to do anything for money. I used your sperm for in vitro fertilization, a clinical procedure, and implanted it in her uterus. The objective was to manufacture a perfect heir, a child with pure Blackwood blood, thereby bypassing the necessity of that barren woman altogether." Then what Dominic's voice sounded like the ragged growl of a caged animal on the edge of losing control entirely. Victoria shrugged, a gesture of casual indifference, as if she were discussing the nuisance of shifting weather patterns. "The plan, quite frankly, didn't unfold the way I had meticulously scripted it. Instead of one perfect baby, Rachel delivered four. For quadruplets." She gave a short, contemptuous snort. "A defective product. I only required a singular, undeniable heir, not a disorganized nursery full of unwanted children. For identical children, how exactly does one divide absolute power? How does one rationally decide who becomes the designated successor? They would simply grow up and inevitably tear each other apart for the privilege of your seat." Dominic's teeth ground together audibly, his jawline hardening into an immovable slab of granite. "What did you do to them?" Victoria smiled, and that particular smile, stretched tight across her face, was sharper and colder than January ice scraped from a pane of glass. "I handled it," she said gently, her tone horrifyingly mild. "I ordered all of them eliminated. All four, cleanly and efficiently. No trace left behind." She tilted her head toward her son, her gaze steeped in bitter mockery. "But it seems some trash is far harder to eliminate than I first calculated." Dominic stood there, rooted to the spot, every syllable spoken by his mother landing like a knife driving straight through the vulnerable center of his chest. But he wasn't finished. The torrent of revelations had only just begun. There were other questions that had festered in the dark. Questions burning him alive from the inside out. And he wasn't leaving this opulent room until he had ripped every last answer from her. "Rachel," he said. His voice scraped raw and rough against his throat. "The surrogate. Where is she now?" Victoria flicked her perfectly manicured hand, a dismissive, impatient gesture as if shooing away an annoying, insignificant fly. Dead. Suicide. Drowned herself in the frigid Hudson River a few short weeks after giving birth. The police conveniently ruled it self-inflicted postpartum depression. A neat and tidy ending to what had become a distressingly messy problem. Dominic looked at his mother, studying her flawless, hard expression, and he knew with the gut-wrenching certainty of the sun's rising in the east, that it was a calculated, heinous lie. Rachel hadn't killed herself. Rachel was killed, eliminated in the same ruthless, expedient way Victoria had just tried to kill 4 innocent, defenseless children. The exact same way she was fundamentally willing to destroy anyone, absolutely anyone, who dared stand in her meticulously planned path. But there was one more question hanging in the suffocating air. The single question he feared most, the question that had relentlessly haunted him for long, agonizing years. He swallowed convulsively, his throat constricting as if an invisible, powerful hand were slowly closing around it. "Liz," he whispered, and his beloved wife's name fell into the heavy silence of the room like the final, desperate prayer of a dying man. "Elizabeth, my wife. Did she know about any of this?" Victoria fell completely silent. For the first time in the entire, harrowing exchange, her mask of cold control shattered, and she fell silent. No cold, instant rebuttal, no contemptuous, patronizing smile, no clever, self-serving justification, only an absolute, crushing silence. A silence so immensely heavy it felt capable of crushing bone and hope. And in the vast emptiness of that silence, Dominic read everything he needed to know. "Mother," he said, his voice raw with disbelief, shaking violently. "What did you do to Liz?" Victoria sighed dramatically, as if she were reluctantly explaining an obvious, tiresome truth to a persistent fool. "She was smarter than I thought," she said, her voice dropping back to a temperature cold as freshly chipped ice. "She found out everything. Somehow, she managed to track down Rachel, she tracked down the clinic where the procedure occurred, she tracked down the children. She knew it all, Dominic, and she was going to expose me to you." Dominic felt his knees spontaneously go weak, as if some unseen force had instantly pulled the bones straight out of his body. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." She had an appointment with a lawyer scheduled for that day. Victoria went on, her voice not shifting in pitch or intensity by even a fraction. "She was going to present damning evidence, expose everything I had spent years meticulously building, destroy everything. Did she truly think she could stand against me? Did she seriously imagine I'd simply sit back and watch her ruin this family's future?" "The car accident," Dominic breathed, his voice sounding thin, like wind passing through the desolate confines of a graveyard. "Liz's car accident. It wasn't an accident, was it?" Victoria looked straight into her son's eyes, her own eyes completely devoid of a single trace of regret, remorse, or humanity. "She was going to utterly destroy everything I built. She was going to take away your future, this family's legacy. I didn't have a choice, Dominic. I had to protect Blackwood Blood and the organization at any and all cost." Dominic's entire world collapsed, shattering into nothingness. He stood there, frozen in his mother's ridiculously luxurious bedroom, and felt everything he'd ever believed in, everything he'd ever loved, everything he'd ever dedicated his life to protecting, instantly shatter into a million irrecoverable pieces. His mother, his own biological mother, the woman who'd given birth to him, who'd gently rocked him to sleep as a child, who'd instructed him how to be a man of power. She'd killed Elizabeth. She'd brutally murdered the woman he loved most deeply in the world. And Liz, his sweet Elizabeth, had died tragically alone. She'd discovered the horrific truth. She'd wanted to save the children he hadn't even known existed until minutes ago. And she died for that act of bravery. She died without managing to convey a single word of warning or truth to him. She died by herself, isolated with a secret far too heavy for any one person to carry. No tears fell. Dominic was incapable of crying yet. The pain was too vast, too impossibly deep. It had completely frozen everything inside him. He only stood there, staring blankly at the woman who'd given him life, seeing her now not as a mother, but as a monster wearing human skin. Then he turned on his heel and walked away. Not a word, not a backward glance. "What are you going to do?" Victoria called out after him, her voice carrying the first sharp hint of genuine uncertainty and panic. "You can't touch me, Dominic. I am this family. Without me, you are utterly nothing. Everything you currently possess is because of me." Dominic didn't look back. He kept walking straight through the door, down the imposing marble stairs, out into the cold, indifferent night, and for the first time in his fiercely controlled life, the most powerful mafia boss in New York didn't know what his next move should be. The Bentley tore through the absolute darkness of the night, the powerful engine roaring like the silent, desperate scream of a mortally wounded beast. Dominic sat behind the wheel. His large hands clamped onto the leather so tightly the knuckles were starkly bone white, and yet still they trembled, shaking violently. For the first time in 35 years of his life, his hands shook like this. He'd held a gun and fired it without the slightest waver. He'd ordered enemies executed, watched them die, without his hands shaking. He'd faced sudden death dozens of times without his hands betraying him. But now, immediately after what he'd just heard from his mother's cold mouth, his hands shook uncontrollably like leaves whipped by a furious storm. Then, finally, the tears came. He couldn't stop them even if he wanted to. They spilled uncontrollably from the corners of his eyes, ran hot down his taut cheeks, and dropped like molten pain onto his $1,000 suit jacket. The most powerful mafia boss in New York was crying uncontrollably like a lost child abandoned on an empty, desolate road at 3 o'clock in the morning. Liz, Liz, Liz. The name kept echoing relentlessly in his head like the slow, deep tolling of a funeral bell. Elizabeth, the cherished wife he'd loved devotedly for 10 years. Elizabeth, the one person who'd given him rare, precious moments of true peace in a world perpetually soaked in blood and casual violence. Elizabeth, who hadn't died in a freak accident the way he'd believed and mourned for 4 long years. She was savagely murdered by his own mother, and she died because she wanted to save the children he hadn't even known existed until tonight. His mind was pure chaos, spinning wildly between gut-ripping grief and a boiling, destructive rage. He wanted to violently turn the car around right now, speed back to face Victoria, to crush her throat with his own bare hands, but he also wanted to pull over immediately, to drop his head onto the steering wheel and weep until there were absolutely no tears left in him. The phone rang, its abrupt sound slicing sharply through the terrible silence inside the car. Dominic glanced down at the screen. Marcus. He drew a deep, shuddering breath, forcing his voice back toward a semblance of normal before he answered the call. "What, boss?" Marcus's voice was sharp with urgency. Urgent enough that Dominic felt the spike of dread instantly. Something was seriously wrong. "We've got a problem. A serious one. Talk." The security cameras were hacked. The entire system went down for about 15 critical minutes. When we finally managed to bring it back up, then Marcus hesitated. And that professional hesitation, slight as it was, made Dominic's blood turn instantly to ice in his veins. "Then what?" "They're gone. Boss, the maid, and the 4 kids. The room's completely empty. Not a trace remains." Dominic slammed the brake pedal so violently the heavy Bentley spun sideways across the slick road. The tires screamed a desperate, high-pitched protest on the asphalt. The phone nearly flew out of his grasp. "What?" "I'm sorry, boss. I don't understand how this could have happened. Our security system is the absolute best. No one can." Dominic's phone vibrated instantly. A new message alert. He looked down at the screen, an unknown number, and the words that appeared stole the remaining breath from his body. "If you want to keep the kids and the maid safe, don't do anything stupid. V." Attached was a photo. Sophia was lying on a cold concrete floor, her capable hands tied behind her back with rough rope, her mouth sealed tightly with black industrial tape. Her large brown eyes were wide, filled with naked terror. And the 4 children, his 4 sons he'd only just learned existed, were huddled together in a far corner, their small faces wet with silent tears, their mouths open in a soundless, desperate scream. Victoria. His mother had moved far faster and more decisively than he had ever anticipated. She knew he would come to confront her, knew he would inevitably uncover the truth, and she'd already prepared her lethal next move. But how had she managed to penetrate his impenetrable mansion? How had she so easily bypassed the tightest, most sophisticated security system in all of New York? The horrific answer hit him like a physical punch to the gut. An insider, someone he implicitly trusted, someone he'd counted as family, had betrayed him, had been working as a viper for Victoria all along. Marcus, Dominic thundered into the phone, his voice suddenly deep and menacing, like rolling storm clouds. Gather everyone. Everyone. I want every soldier, every available contact, every pair of eyes in this entire city searching for them. Whoever finds them gets paid 10 times over. Whoever hides information dies. Boss, what in God's name is going on? Do it now. He ended the call abruptly, hurled the phone onto the passenger seat with a crash, and floored the accelerator. The Bentley roared again and shot into the dark night at a crazed, impossible speed. For the first time in his life, the most powerful mafia boss in New York had completely and utterly lost control. His gray eyes weren't cold anymore. They were fiercely burning. The fire of pure, unadulterated hell. My mother wants to play this game, he snarled through tightly clenched teeth. Fine. She seems to have forgotten who taught me how to play. Sophia woke gradually in absolute darkness. Her head felt like it was being split cleanly by a hammer. Her temples were intensely throbbing where she'd been struck when she instinctively tried to fight off the men who had burst so violently into the room. She remembered that terrifying instant. The door flying open with a splintering crash, black shapes surging in, the children screaming in pure terror. Then a brutal fist to her head and everything dissolving into nothingness. Where was she now? She blinked repeatedly, forcing her eyes to slowly adjust in the ink-black, claustrophobic space. The thick, heavy smell of dampness hit her immediately. The acrid odor of old, rotting concrete, of stagnant water, of utter abandonment. A basement. She was trapped in some kind of basement. She didn't know where exactly. She didn't know how far from the familiar Blackwood mansion. She tried to move her arms and realized her hands were tightly tied behind her back with rough, abrasive rope. The coarse fibers bit into her wrists, but strangely, it wasn't tied too tight. Maybe the kidnappers had been in too much of a hurry. Or maybe they didn't view her as much of a physical threat. After all, what measurable harm could a thin, insignificant housemaid possibly do? Mom. The weak, tiny call made Sophia's heart violently clench in her chest. She turned her head painfully and saw the 4 children curled together in a corner, for small, shivering shadows trembling violently in the dark. Oliver, the youngest, was crawling blindly toward her, fresh tears streaming down his pale cheeks. Mom, I'm scared. He sobbed uncontrollably, his voice catching. The witch took us. She has snake eyes. Mom, I'm scared of her. Sophia forced herself upright, despite the fact that her head still swam dangerously. I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here. She looked quickly at the other 3. Ethan had Noah pulled tight against his chest, trying desperately to look strong and brave, even though his gray eyes were brimming with fear. But Lucas worried her most deeply. The boy sat perfectly still, eyes wide and fixed on nothing at all. Not crying, not speaking, entirely immobile like a small stone statue. She'd seen that unnerving look before, in the first traumatized nights after she'd found them. The look of a child hurt too deeply, retreating completely inward to escape a brutal, immediate reality. Old trauma was clearly rising again. Listen to me, Sophia said, her voice shaking badly, but she forced it steady and loud enough to carry. I'll protect you. I promise you right now. No matter what happens, I won't let anyone hurt you. Footsteps sounded on the stone stairs above. The precise click of expensive high heels on concrete, slow, measured, like a terrifying countdown to the end of the world. Then the light from a single, bare bulb snapped on instantly, blinding her, and Sophia had to tightly squint. And there she was. Victoria Blackwood descended into the miserable basement as if she were making a magnificent entrance at an upper-class gala. She wore an elegant black designer dress, a triple-strand pearl necklace at her throat, her hair swept into a flawless updo, her face impeccably made up without a single visible wrinkle. The grotesque contrast between her refined, untouchable appearance and the damp, foul-smelling basement was so jarring. It was horrifying. Victoria's cold, dismissive eyes swept the room methodically and finally stopped on Sophia with undisguised contempt, as if she were inspecting an insignificant insect crawling beneath her heel. "So, you're the nameless one who saved them," she said, her voice gentle, but sharp as a honed blade. "Who exactly are you to raise what I deliberately threw away?" Sophia didn't answer. She only held Victoria's fierce gaze, not bowing her head, not trembling in submission. "Nothing to say." Victoria gave a short, derisive laugh. "Of course. What could you possibly say? A nameless little servant girl, thinking she can play the role of hero and rescue a few abandoned babies. Simply ridiculous." She stepped closer, her heels tapping a rhythmic beat on the concrete floor. "My original plan was simply to cleanly dispose of these brats. But now you know far too much. So I have to deal with you as well. All 5 of you, clean and tidy. I'll simply blame it all on Dominic's numerous enemies in the underworld. A kidnapping for ransom that regrettably went wrong. Something believable like that. My son will suffer, of course. But then he'll eventually forget. Men always forget, and everything will ultimately go back to the way it was always meant to be. Mr. Dominic will know the truth," Sophia said, her voice ringing with sudden, unexpected clarity in the empty basement. Victoria laughed again, a sound utterly cold as ice cracking. "My son will never believe a nameless servant over his own mother." "Who do you think you are?" Sophia lifted her bruised chin defiantly, her brown eyes glinting dangerously under the dim light. "But he'll believe his own blood." Victoria went silent for a single second, and the false smile on her mouth died a terrible death. She turned abruptly to the 2 henchmen standing impassively at the foot of the stairs. "Deal with all 5 before morning." Then she went back up the stairs without even a single backward look. The lights snapped off. Absolute darkness instantly swallowed the basement again. Sophia heard the henchman's heavy footsteps coming closer. She heard the metallic, unmistakable sound of a gun being professionally racked. And in the crushing dark, her eyes dropped instinctively to the floor where a small shard of broken glass gleamed faintly, catching the faintest sliver of light from the crack beneath the door. Dominic Blackwood's enormous empire woke up violently in the night. From rundown, shadowed apartments in the Bronx to lavish, glittering penthouses in Manhattan, phones rang incessantly, frantic messages went out, and hundreds of heavily armed men climbed instantly out of bed with weapons firmly in their hands. This wasn't an investigation anymore. This was a brutal, full-scale war. Every security camera in the city, from shadowed, refuse-strewn alleys to brightly lit, central avenues, was violently hacked into Dominic's vast system. The best, most expensive hackers money could buy worked without rest or complaint, tearing through thousands of images, desperately searching for any sign of the truck that had taken Sophia and the children away. Every single lead, every informant, every single debtor in the entire city received the exact same chilling message. Find them or die. Whoever finds them gets paid 10 times over. Dominic told the massive crowd of his men gathered tightly in a cavernous warehouse in Brooklyn. His voice was hard as tempered steel. Whoever hides information, even the smallest, most insignificant piece, will wish they'd never been born. He wasn't Dominic Blackwood anymore. The polished, controlled businessman in an expensive, perfectly tailored suit. The man who occasionally appeared on the covers of business magazines with a confident, measured smile. He was now a pure predator stalking his prey. Cold, utterly ruthless, without a single drop of mercy or compassion. The gray in his eyes held no warmth whatsoever. They were 2 bottomless pits of unforgiving ice, 2 terrible abysses that swallowed anyone who dared look into them for too long. The insider was forcefully dragged in front of him. One of the bodyguards who'd worked loyally for the Blackwood family for 15 years. He was tied securely to a metal chair, his face bruised and swollen from being beaten during his capture, but he still tried vainly to look tough. Dominic stood directly in front of him and said nothing at all. He only stared with a terrifying gaze that could instantly freeze hell over. Then he drew a long, curved knife from inside his coat, slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every agonizing second of the motion. 15 years, Dominic said, his voice light and soft as the death whisper itself. 15 years you ate my food, took my massive pay, received my family's protection like a trusted brother, and you betrayed me for her. The traitor trembled violently. Mr. Dominic, Victoria, she threatened my family. I didn't have a choice. You had a choice. Dominic cut him off instantly, his voice flat with murderous ice. You chose wrong. He set the razor-sharp blade against the traitor's pinky finger. Now you're going to tell me precisely where she's hiding them, or I'll send each of your fingers to your wife and kids. 1 finger every hour until you've got no fingers left to send. The traitor instantly broke down, sobbing hysterically. He confessed everything without hesitation. The abandoned warehouse just outside the city, the shell company Victoria used to secretly own it. The exact number of guards and where they were positioned. 45 minutes away. Sophia and the children were only 45 minutes away from him. The black convoy tore into the night. 5 heavy SUVs packed tightly with men armed to the teeth with military-grade weaponry. Dominic sat in the back seat of the lead vehicle, mechanically checking the gun in his hand, loading around, unloading it, then loading it again. The motions were mechanical, unconscious, the way he'd done it hundreds of times before bloody, inevitable battles. Marcus sat beside him, watching his boss with intense worry etched on his face. "Boss," he said, his voice hesitant and uncertain. She's your mother. Are you sure about this? She died to me the moment she killed Liz." Dominic cut him off, his voice utterly without a trace of feeling. "The woman sitting in that Manhattan mansion isn't my mother. She's the enemy, and I deal with enemies only one way." The convoy kept speeding relentlessly forward, their headlights slicing through the oppressive dark. Dominic stared out the window, his gray eyes cold and still as a lake sealed over in winter. "Tonight, either my mother loses everything, or I lose everything. There isn't a third choice available." Gunfire suddenly erupted from the floor above. First 1 sharp shot, then 2, then a rapid, deafening chain of blasts that tore violently through the sudden quiet night. Sophia lay paralyzed in the basement darkness. Her heart was pounding wildly, uncontrollably in her chest. Her ears were straining desperately to listen over the clamor. Someone was coming. Somebody was coming for them. Screams, the frantic sound of running footsteps, shattering glass. It all fused into a violent, destructive symphony. The guard stationed placidly at the foot of the stairs whipped around violently. His face was instantly drained pale in the weak, flickering light. His eyes were wild and desperate, like a trapped animal driven into a corner. He yanked out his handgun, his hand shaking hard with fear, and swung the barrel dangerously toward Sophia and the children. "Kill them first," he muttered frantically, panic thick in his voice. She ordered it done before morning. Kill them all and run." Sophia didn't have time to be afraid. Through the agonizing hours trapped in the absolute darkness, she'd been quietly sawing the rough rope against the shard of broken glass positioned beneath her feet. Little by little, agonizingly slowly, until the tough fibers finally gave way. Now her hands were free, and the glass, sharp as a surgical knife, sat securely hidden in her clenched palm. When the guard stepped closer, his finger already tightening on the trigger mechanism, Sophia exploded upward with primal force. For years of raising for terrified children alone had taught her something no book ever could: the fierce, innate strength of a mother's survival instinct. She launched herself at him like a wild panther, moving faster than he could possibly react, and drove the sharp shard deep into his wrist. The guard screamed in agony, the gun clattering loudly to the concrete floor with a metallic ring. He swung his other fist wildly into Sophia's face, the blow staggering her, blood instantly spilling from the corner of her mouth. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Her 4 children were huddled and sobbing in the corner, crying and calling out her name. She snatched the shard back up off the floor and struck again into his shoulder, then into his chest, stabbing violently until he collapsed heavily and didn't move anymore. She stood there gasping for air. Her whole body was smeared sickeningly with blood. His blood and her own. At that precise moment, the basement door above blew open with explosive force. Light poured in like a blinding, roaring waterfall, so intensely bright Sophia had to tightly squint against it. And in that brilliant light, a massive, dark figure appeared dramatically at the top of the stairs. Dominic stood there, gun firmly in his hand, his burning eyes sweeping the basement methodically as he searched. Then he saw her. Sophia stood rigid in the middle of the room, her hair tangled and heavily stuck with blood, her face bruised and streaked, her hands still tightly clenched around the shard-stained crimson. The yellow rubber gloves she'd been wearing since the kidnapping were now a deep, horrifying crimson. At her feet lay the motionless guard, and, behind her, the 4 children were huddled together, shielded by the slender but resilient body of their mother. Sophia stood like a sculpture of defiance, a war goddess who had stepped not out of marble, but out of fire and sheer will. She was a devastating convergence of traits, brutal strength tempered by heartbreaking tenderness, overwhelming power held within a fragile human frame. Their eyes met across the short distance, an undeniable connection passing between them. Gray met brown, and in that frozen instant all barriers dissolved. There was no longer a towering crime boss and a frightened housemaid. There were only 2 people, partners in desperation, who had fought to protect the same priceless commodity. For innocent children who, by all rights, should have been dead long ago. Dominic ran the final steps down the basement stairs, vaulting over the guard's crumpled body, and pulled her into his arms. He held Sophia, gripping her tightly as if she might dissipate, and he held the 4 children who were now sobbing against his legs, clinging to him with raw, desperate strength. For the first time in 4 years, since the day Elizabeth died, Dominic held anyone outside of a fleeting, functional handshake. He clung to them, afraid that if he loosened his grip, they would dissolve like a hallucination under the harsh basement lights. The children were utterly unafraid of him now. Maybe it was an inherited instinct deep in their blood. Maybe it was the universal knowledge that this man had saved them. They clung to him, crying freely, the way they'd never been permitted to cry in all their fearful lives. Oliver, the youngest, lifted his tear-drenched face to the unfamiliar man holding them, his innocence shimmering even amidst the sobs. "Who are you?" he asked. Dominic choked on the air he tried to breathe, his throat tightening painfully, his eyes stinging. "Dad," he whispered, his voice ravaged and rough with emotion. "I'm your dad." Sophia heard that single word, and the exhaustion that had sustained her through the fight finally broke. A genuine smile, her first since the day of the kidnapping, touched her lips. Then, the world slipped into a velvet darkness as she fainted in the safety of his arms, utterly spent by the trauma. Dominic lifted her, carefully shifting her weight. He moved with a reverence he usually reserved for priceless artwork, gentle as if he were holding the most vital treasure on earth. The 4 children followed immediately at his heels, small shadows refusing to leave him by even a single step. "Marcus," he called out, his voice instantly turning cold, steel replacing the earlier vulnerability. "Get them to the car. Secure them. Anyone who even looks their way, shoot." Then he turned back toward the shadows, his gray eyes darkening to the furious black of an approaching storm. "And my mother," he commanded. "Bring her here." Victoria Blackwood was dragged into the light, hauled forward like a stray dog on a chain. Her hands were cuffed behind her back, the elegant black designer dress now wrinkled, streaked with dirt, and smeared with blood from the earlier scuffle. Her flawless, expensive updo had come undone, silver strands of hair wild and tangled across her impeccably lined face. But even in this utterly wrecked state, Victoria still clutched her arrogance like a shield. She lifted her chin, staring down her son as if she were a reigning queen and he and everyone else were nothing but inconsequential pieces on her vast chessboard. "You won't do anything to me, Dominic," she stated, her voice still sharp and icy, though a faint, telltale tremor betrayed her at the edges. You can hate me, you can resent me, but you can't destroy me. I am you. Everything you have, everything you are. I meticulously built it. Without me, you're just a nobody kid. Dominic stood motionless, looking at the woman who had given him life, yet stripped him of his soul. The gray in his eyes now held no raging fire, no immediate, burning fury. They were something far worse, cold. Cold as the eternal ice cap at the North Pole. Cold as the finality of death. You think I'm going to kill you? He asked, his tone so terrifyingly calm that it sucked all the oxygen out of the room. You think I'll pull a gun and end this with one clean bullet? No. Death is too easy for you. Death is far too kind. He stepped closer, looking down at her as if she were a common insect trapped beneath his heavy heel. I'm going to take everything you possess, everything you value more than blood, more than your own children. He began to deliver the sentence, each word meticulously chosen, falling like a razor-sharp blade carving into Victoria's carefully constructed soul. Bank accounts frozen. All of them, from the numbered Swiss accounts to the secret lockboxes you thought no one could ever know about. I know them all. Victoria's face went instantly pale, the blood draining away. Real estate seized. The Manhattan mansion, the Hamptons estate, the penthouse in Miami. All of it will be auctioned off. You won't have a roof to shelter you. She began to shake visibly, her lips pressed tight into a thin line of resistance. Your power network destroyed. The people you bought, the ones you had in your iron grip, they will learn that Victoria Blackwood is nobody now. No one will take your calls. No one will follow your orders. You will be erased from the world you created. Victoria's eyes started to glisten, but she still tried to grit through the pain. And your reputation, Dominic finished, his voice the sharpest, most deadly knife of all. The story of the woman who hired a surrogate, abandoned for newborn babies in a blizzard, killed that surrogate, and then murdered her own daughter-in-law, will be delivered to every single newspaper in this city. The name Victoria Blackwood will become permanently synonymous with monster. You can't, Victoria whispered, her voice finally starting to crack, revealing the fear beneath the ice. You will live, Dominic cut in, his voice unwavering. But you will live precisely like the children you tried to kill. With nothing. No money, no home, no power, no honor. You will finally know what it feels like to be utterly thrown away. And then the truly unthinkable happened. Victoria Blackwood, the legendary Iron Woman, the one who had built an empire from absolute nothing, the one who had never once bowed to anyone in her life, dropped to her knees. Her knees hit the cold, unforgiving concrete with a sickening thud, and she began to cry. For the first time in her long, destructive life, she wept. Not out of regret for her victims, not out of pity for the innocent lives she had crushed, but because she had lost everything she truly valued. Her status, her control, her world. You can't do this to me, she sobbed, her voice a raw, wounded animal moan. I am your mother. I gave birth to you. I raised you, damn you. You can't. You did it to my wife, Dominic stated, his voice not shifting an inch from its deadly calm. You killed Liz. You did it to my children. You tried to kill 4 innocent children because they didn't fit into your perfect, sick plan. And you did it to me. You lied to me for 5 agonizing years. You let me live in misery over Liz's death without ever knowing the despicable truth. He turned slightly toward Marcus. Call the police. Hand her over to them. Victoria was hauled roughly to her feet and led toward the police convoy waiting outside, the one Dominic had meticulously arranged in advance. Before she was shoved into the car, she looked back at her son one final time, her eyes red, her face ruined by tears and defeat. I did everything for you, she whispered, a desperate, final justification. Everything was for you. Dominic turned his broad back on her, the rejection absolute. No, he said without looking around. You did everything for you, always for you. The car door slammed with a heavy, final sound, and the police convoy raced into the engulfing night, carrying away the woman who had once been the untouchable queen of New York's underworld. Dominic stood alone in the darkness of the aftermath, watching the flashing lights until they vanished entirely. Only then did he turn toward the waiting ambulance parked nearby. Through the window, he saw Sophia awake, propped up and holding the 4 children close in her arms. She looked out, met his weary gaze, and she smiled. That was his family. Afternoon sunlight, filtered through the delicate white hospital curtain, fell across Sophia's pale face. She blinked slowly, trying to bring the sterile room into focus after 2 days lost in a fevered, drifting sleep. The familiar, medicinal sting of antiseptic filled her nose. The heart monitor beside her maintained its steady, mechanical beep-beep, and when she finally managed to turn her head, she saw him. Dominic Blackwood sat in the visitor's chair by her bedside, his head bowed, one hand wrapped possessively around hers. The most powerful mafia boss in New York looked utterly defeated, like an ordinary man who had been drained dry of all energy and strength. Dark stubble shadowed his rigid jaw. Deep purplish circles lay under his eyes like fresh bruises, and his $1,000 suit was hopelessly wrinkled, rumpled as if he'd worn it, fought in it, and slept in it for days on end. And perhaps he had. Sophia shifted slightly on the stiff sheets, and Dominic woke instantly. His gray eyes snapped open, glassy with disorientation at first, then flaring bright with piercing recognition when he realized she was awake. "You're awake," he said, his voice husky and rough from lack of sleep and strain. "You slept for 2 full days. The doctor said you were running on fumes, completely exhausted. You lost some blood. You have a mild concussion, but they assure me you will make a full recovery." Sophia attempted to sit up, but a sharp wave of pain rippled through her entire body, and she winced, closing her eyes briefly. Dominic was immediately supporting her, his strong hands moving with surprising tenderness, adjusting the pillows behind her back with a carefulness she never would have imagined a man like him capable of. "The kids," she whispered, her throat raw and dry. "Where are they? Are they truly okay?" "They're okay," Dominic reassured her, gently rubbing the back of her hand. "They are in the next room being looked after by a specialist nurse. No serious injuries, just trauma and fear. They kept asking for you, insisting on seeing you, but I told them they had to wait until Mom woke up." Sophia let out a massive breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, the relief so profound that tears gathered at the corners of her eyes. They were safe. Her children were safe. That was the only knowledge she needed to hold on to. "Miller," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a low, heavy register. "Sophia, I owe you a deep apology." She looked at him, startled by the unexpected vulnerability in his gaze. "You almost died because of my family," he continued, his gray eyes not flinching away from hers, accepting the full weight of the guilt. "My mother almost killed you and the children. Everything you went through, being kidnapped, beaten, locked in that dark basement. All of it was because of Blackwood secrets and Blackwood malice." "I'm sorry." Sophia was quiet for a long moment, then she shook her head slightly, rejecting the premise. "I didn't die because of your family," she said, her voice small but infused with a quiet, certain strength. "I lived because of my children." Dominic blinked once, and she saw a sudden, soft glimmer in his gray eyes, something exposed and utterly vulnerable. Sophia hesitated for only a heartbeat. Then she corrected herself, her voice barely a breath. "Our children." Those 2 words hung in the sterile hospital air, heavy with meaning, hope, and an unspoken future. Dominic didn't speak, but the subtle, powerful way he tightened his grip on her hand spoke volumes, a silent vow sealed between them. The hospital room door suddenly swung open, and 4 small, highly energized hurricanes burst in. Mom, Ethan, Noah, Lucas, and Oliver raced toward the bed, scrambling up, fighting one another for space to hug Sophia all at once. She laughed through her tears, holding all 4 small bodies close, breathing in the familiar scent of their hair, feeling the solid, comforting warmth of their small limbs pressing against her. "Mom, you slept way too long," Oliver pouted, burying his face into her gown. "I missed you. Don't sleep again," Noah insisted, fresh tears sliding down his rosy cheeks. "I was scared you wouldn't wake up." The quiet hospital room was instantly filled with a glorious, chaotic symphony of laughter, crying, and the breathless chatter of 4 children all talking over one another, vying to tell their mother everything that had transpired over the last 2 days. It was noisy, chaotic, and so overwhelmingly beautiful that it hurt to breathe. Dominic quietly stepped back, leaning against the pale wall, watching the perfect, messy scene unfold. And for the first time in 4 years, since the day he buried Elizabeth, he felt the permanent ice around his heart begin, undeniably, to melt. That night, long after the children had finally been coaxed to sleep in the adjacent room, Dominic returned to Sophia's room. He paused in the doorway, momentarily hesitant, awkward like a young boy asking for his first job. "I have a proposal for you, Miller," he stated quietly. "Stay. Not as a maid. Stay as family." Sophia looked at him, her brown eyes filled with doubt and caution. "You don't have to do this out of gratitude. I saved the children, that was my job." "This isn't about gratitude," Dominic countered, stepping slowly closer. "The kids need you. You're the only one they trust completely, the one who raised them. You are their mother in every way that truly matters. And I need you too." The admission was raw, shocking even to his own ears. Sophia lowered her gaze, thinking. "I don't want to be a burden," she murmured. "You saved my children's lives, Sophia," Dominic said, his voice softening into an unexpected tenderness. "You are the strongest person I have ever met. You are never a burden." Silence settled between them. Then Sophia lifted her head, her brown eyes shining with resolve. "For the kids," she said quietly, setting the condition. "I'll stay only for the kids." Dominic smiled, his first genuine, unburdened smile in 4 years. It was a smile that transformed his hard, etched face, making him look strangely warm and accessible. "For now," he conceded, "I will wholeheartedly accept that reason." The first nights back at the Blackwood mansion were a kind of domestic hell. Not the hell of violence, betrayal, and blood Dominic had always known, but the wrenching hell of children's cries tearing through the oppressive dark, of night terrors that refused to loosen their merciless grip, of 4 small bodies jolting awake and screaming for their mother in sheer, raw panic. The first night, all 4 of them flatly refused to sleep alone in their massive, luxurious beds. They piled onto Sophia's queen-sized mattress, clinging to her as if she would vanish the second they released their hold. Dominic stood helpless in the doorway, watching the desperate tangle of limbs, utterly lost and not knowing what action to take. He was a man who could effortlessly control an entire underworld empire. A man whose cold reputation could make hardened, cold-blooded killers tremble. Yet, standing before for crying, frightened children, he was utterly, painfully useless. Sophia began to teach him bit by bit, with the same endless patience she had employed to raise those 4 children alone for 4 difficult years. "Don't yell," she instructed him after the first time. He instinctively raised his voice when Noah spilled a glass of milk onto an antique rug. To them, yelling sounds like death. They have lived under the constant threat of fear for far too long. Dominic learned to soften his naturally booming voice. He learned to kneel so he could speak to them at their eye level, dissolving his physically threatening size. Instead of looming over them like a dangerous tower, he learned patience, the hardest, most humbling lesson for a man accustomed to giving singular orders and being obeyed instantly. Lucas was the one who broke Dominic's guarded heart the most completely. That quiet, watchful boy had developed a profound habit of hiding food. Under his pillow, beneath the mattress, stashed deep in his pockets. Every single night, Dominic found stale bread crusts, bruised candy, even cold, hardened rice tucked all over Lucas's immaculate room. On the 3rd night, Dominic sat beside his son, took his hand, and led him gently into the massive, silent kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning. He swung open the enormous refrigerator door so Lucas could see inside. "Look," he said gently, keeping his voice low and steady. "It's full. It will never run out." You do not have to hide food anymore, son. Lucas stared at the overflowing refrigerator, then at his father's face, and then, slowly, he began to cry. A silent, deep weeping that spoke of years of famine and fear. Dominic gathered his son into his arms. It was the first time in his life he had held a child that way, not for protection, but for comfort, and he let him cry until the exhaustion of the release finally pulled him to sleep against his father's chest. Oliver, the baby of the group, simply could not sleep unless he was physically held. And so Dominic Blackwood, the most feared Mafia boss in New York, learned to lie down beside his child in the enormous, silent bed, allowing the little boy to curl into the protective circle of his arm, listening to the steady, comforting thrum of Dominic's heartbeat until sleep finally claimed him. Sometimes Dominic stayed awake that way all night, not daring to shift even an inch, terrified he might wake his son and disrupt his hard-won peace. And then there were the moments that made every sleepless, anxious night entirely worth the cost. The first time Ethan, the oldest and most cautious, called him Daddy. Just one small word, perfectly natural, as if he'd been saying it all his life. Dominic froze utterly still in the long marble hallway, his heart tightening painfully, his eyes burning with unshed emotion. The first time all four of them squealed in unison and raced to the front door when they heard his car pull into the drive. 8 small arms wrapped tightly around his legs, for faces lifted high with bright, radiant, unconditional smiles. He almost wept right there in front of them. And the first time he sat at the grand table with his entire fragile family, a simple plate of golden rice steaming in front of him, the rice Sophia had cooked, the cheap, life-sustaining dish that had kept 4 children alive for 4 years. He lifted a spoonful to his mouth, and suddenly he understood why she called it gold. Not just because of the color, but because selfless, profound love had been cooked into every single grain. The mansion began to change radically. Priceless, cold antiques were carefully packed away and replaced with bright, resilient plastic toys. The stark, silent walls began to fill with the children's crooked, exuberant crayon drawings. The deadly silence that had ruled this mausoleum-like house for 4 years was replaced by laughter, shrieks of delight, and the thunderous beat of little feet racing up and down the massive marble stairs. The mansion that had once been a tomb for a grieving widower had finally become the loud, warm, imperfect shelter of a family. 6 months passed in a beautiful, rapid dream of adjustment. One night after the children were deeply asleep, Dominic walked into the living room and found Sophia bending low to pick up the toys scattered across the polished floor. Moonlight pouring through the enormous window washed over her face, laying a gentle silver sheen on her skin, and it caught the soft curve of her smile when she located Oliver's favorite, missing teddy bear. Dominic stood there, watching her in silence, and his heart began to beat out of its ruthless, calculated rhythm. But this time, it was not the cold, sharp beat of fear, but the warm, insistent rhythm of desire and recognition. 1 year later, the bright June sun shone down warmly over the garden behind the Blackwood mansion. But this was no longer the forbidden, pristine garden of a year ago, where every blade of grass was trimmed to painful perfection and no one dared set foot. Now the lawn had been worn into uneven patches by bicycle wheels, by loud, clumsy soccer games, and by 4 pairs of small, restless feet that never stopped running. A long, brightly colored party table sat proudly in the middle of the yard, covered in vivid cloths. Blue, red, purple, yellow balloons tied to every chair, and laughter rang out everywhere, impossible to contain. Today was the boy's 5th birthday. Dominic stood rigidly at the large grill, beads of sweat beading on his forehead, his face smeared with barbecue sauce. He wore a heavy black apron printed with the words, "The Boss," a goofy gift the children had enthusiastically chosen for him on Father's Day. Looking at him like this, wrestling desperately with the grilled meat, muttering curses under his breath when the flames leapt too high, no one would ever have guessed he was the man who once made all of New York tremble. He was simply a father. Sophia stepped out from the kitchen door, and Dominic turned to look at her as if he were witnessing the sunrise for the first time in his life. She wore a pale yellow dress that seemed to capture the sunlight, her long black hair lifting softly in the gentle breeze, and on the ring finger of her left hand, a simple gold wedding band flashed under the sun. They had married 3 months earlier in a quiet, small ceremony attended only by the 4 children and a few close people. No show, no press, just love and simple, honest promises. In her hands was a large, steaming pot, carrying a deep, familiar, irresistible scent that everyone in this new family had come to love. "Here comes the yellow rice," Sophia called out happily, and the response was instantaneous. "Golden rice," for shouts rang out at once, and the children charged toward the table like a herd of enthusiastic baby elephants, nearly knocking the whole setup over in their excitement. Ethan, Noah, Lucas, and Oliver, for healthy, sturdy 5-year-old boys with rosy, chubby cheeks, bright, fearless eyes, and not a trace of the dark shadows or fear left in them. They were ordinary children now, happy, secure, and loved without condition. Looking at them, no one could have imagined that only a year earlier they had nearly died in a cold, dark basement. 1 month earlier, Dominic had received the curt word that Victoria had died in prison of a sudden heart attack. He hadn't attended the funeral. He hadn't shed a single tear. He had felt no regret. That night, when Sophia gently asked if he was okay, he said only one simple sentence: "Everything is truly finished now." And it was. The malicious ghost of Victoria Blackwood had finally been buried with her, and the new Blackwood family could move forward without ever needing to look back. When everyone had taken their seats and the food was beautifully laid out, Dominic rose and lifted a tall glass of orange juice high. The entire table went instantly quiet, even the 4 lively boys, as if they instinctively knew this was a moment that mattered deeply. "1 year ago," he began, his voice low, warm, and rich with feeling, "I came home and saw a scene I mistakenly thought was a crime. For strange children sitting at my dinner table, cared for by a maid I thought I understood." He looked across the table at Sophia, and the gray in his eyes softened to an expression of profound adoration. "It turned out to be the best, most beautiful thing that ever happened to me." He rested a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm and protective. "This woman taught me a fundamental lesson I had never learned in 35 years of living. She taught me that real gold isn't stored in Swiss banks, isn't found in million-dollar properties, isn't in power or in other people's fear." He looked down tenderly at the pot of golden rice steaming in the center of the festive table. "Real gold is in this humble dish. It is in this family. It is in 4 children who call me Dad, and in the woman who taught me how to love again from the very beginning. Happy birthday, boys," he said, lifting his glass higher. "Thank you for giving me the chance to be a father." "Happy birthday," everyone shouted together, and the clink of glasses rose in a joyful sound with the explosion of laughter. The meal unfolded in a whirlwind of warmth and happiness. The boys fought to tell their stories, fought to grab food, sometimes yelling at each other in frustration, then making up again a second later, forgetting their argument. Sophia and Dominic sat side by side, trading quiet glances now and then, sometimes holding hands beneath the table like nervous, new lovers. Then Oliver, the youngest, lifted his small head, his mouth still smeared brilliantly with golden rice, and asked a question that froze the entire table. "Daddy, when I grow up, can I be Mafia like you?" Silence descended, thick and complete. Everyone held their breath, unsure of how to react to the casual question. Sophia covered her mouth with her hand, unsure whether to burst out laughing or start worrying immediately. Then Dominic Blackwood burst out, laughing, loud, full, echoing through the garden, the kind of untamed laughter he had forgotten he was capable of, the joyous, unburdened laughter of a man who was truly, finally happy. "You can be anything you want, Oliver," he said, still chuckling deeply. "A doctor, an astronaut, a painter, anything you dream of in the world. But first," he pointed sternly to Oliver's plate, "finish your rice." Oliver grinned and bent back over his food, completely unaware why his simple question had made the adults react so strangely. The sun began its slow descent, staining the whole garden in a deep, peaceful golden dusk. The Blackwood family sat, gathered tightly around the table, scarred but perfectly whole, beautifully imperfect, and finally truly belonging to one another. They ate the humble pot of golden rice. Around that worn table, the sounds of genuine laughter and carefree chatter filled the air, a melody far sweeter than any applause from his former life. They simply loved. And in those quiet, luminous moments, the man once known as the most merciless mafia boss in all of New York, the terrifying figure who commanded fear and made the entire underworld tremble, finally understood the profound truth. The elusive treasure he had spent a lifetime ruthlessly pursuing, power, dominance, and endless stacks of illicit money, was a shadow. What mattered was a simple, steaming pot of golden rice, the fearless woman whose spirit had saved his soul, and the 4 young voices that called him Dad. This was his true empire. The end. This narrative, raw and deeply moving, crystallizes several essential lessons about the human condition. Lesson 1. We learn that the architecture of a true family is not built on biology or shared bloodlines. It is forged in the fires of shared sacrifice and unconditional commitment, the unwavering willingness to lay down everything for one another. Sophia was not the biological mother of those 4 brave boys, yet she embodies motherhood in every significant, enduring definition of the word. Lesson 2. Genuine wealth cannot be quantified by bank balances or material possessions. It is measured exclusively by the abundance of love freely given and received, by the irreplaceable, cherished moments spent beside the souls who anchor your life. And perhaps the most vital truth of all, it is never, ever too late to seek transformation, to shed the burdens of the past, to finally learn the language of selfless love, and to courageously step into the light as the best, most authentic version of yourself. If this compelling journey resonated within your heart, if it stirred a deep emotion, please take a moment to hit the like button and share this profound video. Send it specifically to those individuals in your life who you know, deep down, deserve the grace and power of a second chance. Ensure you subscribe to our channel immediately so that you never miss these deeply moving and transformative stories we bring to you daily. Now, we turn to you, our dedicated audience. How did this extraordinary tale leave you feeling? Did it challenge your definition of power? Have you been fortunate enough to encounter a person with the fierce, nurturing spirit of a Sophia in your own life? Please, do not hesitate to leave a comment in the section below. We genuinely and profoundly value hearing what this story has ignited within the deepest chambers of your heart. To all our cherished viewers watching this video, we extend our heartfelt wishes for enduring good health, a life overflowing with genuine joy, and a heart that remains perpetually full of light and unconditional love every single day. Farewell for now, and we look forward to seeing you in the next installment.